Hey guys, welcome back to another video. It is me, Mr. Cameraman, and today we're going to be talking about another criminal law video. So this is our sixth one, and these have been doing relatively well. I'm recording this before the Superman one actually comes out, so I have no clue how that one is going to do, but I really hope that one does well. Today we're going to be talking about our first Marvel one, and we're going to be talking about Magneto. So we're going to be focusing on X-Men First Class, and specifically the Cuban Missile Crisis. And because Shaw is the main villain of X-Men First Class, and really Xavier's the hero, is Magneto a hero or a villain? So in a lot of these, it's been pretty cut clear. Like Superman's a hero, Batman's a hero, Joker is a villain. This one's a little bit weirder because he is a villain in other ones, but he isn't really a villain in this one. So we're going to be talking about if he really is a villain or a hero, and then we're also going to talk about if he could be innocent or guilty. So before we get into it, though, if you haven't joined the Google Classroom already, I would suggest doing it because we're going to be using that in future videos, and I really hope that a few people can join it and really try to share their ideas so I can make a video talking about court cases you wanted me to talk about, or so you can learn about a lot more of it in ways that I can't talk about in the videos. Because in here, I try to make it a lot simpler. There, I go a lot deeper into it, so I suggest you join. Besides from that, let's jump right into it. So in X-Men First Class, Magneto really commits numerous crimes during the climax of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is, if you don't remember, where all the ships are kind of rushing the beach, and it's the Russians and then the Americans. And then all that stuff happens. He murders Shaw. He throws the rockets back at them. He paralyzes Xavier, a lot of stuff. So he also goes into the minds of some Soviet people to shoot the rockets. It's a lot. And all of this really happens not just because he's helping Xavier, which he is, but he's doing it a lot to help his selfish manner of killing Shaw. Because from the start, his goal was to kill Shaw, and that's what it boils down to at the end. So you could view this two ways, and I'm going to set the two things. Then we're going to talk about a lot more criminal law aspects that we didn't do in the past videos. So we're going to be talking about here really two different main things. Number one, could he be claimed guilty because this was all for a vendetta against Shaw? Because that could be a way you go, and if you go that way, he's a villain. However, you could see him as a hero if he is trying to protect the mutant kind. And yes, these are terrible actions, but the question is if these actions are necessary to protect mutant kind. And what could you say from that? So, number one, we're not going to be able to use Magneto's past in this court case because that has nothing to do with the situations of what we're going to be talking about today. So let's not even think about anything that happens in the 40s. What we're going to focus on is the criminal law things. And we have 7 big ones here. We have attempted mass murder, sabotage, first-degree murder, but we'll get to that later, the destruction of property, acts of terrorism, treason, and assault. So he is an American. I think you could view him as an American citizen. I'm not really going to talk about treason too much, but let's talk about a few of the ones we're really going to focus on is attempted mass murder, sabotage, murder, specifically in the first degree. We're going to get to that. A little bit of destruction of property, and then terrorism is a big one we're going to get to. So we're going to be arguing really these 5 points. The assault and treason, I'm not really going to go into. Because if we were to talk about assault, I think that would then go weird with all my other videos. And then I think assault would just be too far. And then as for treason, you then have to go into the whole fact if he really was working for the FBI and CIA, if he's considered an American citizen. At that point, we don't have those answers. So I don't think that's fair to argue, but we're going to be arguing those 5 main points, which we'll get into right now. So the first point we're going to be talking about is the attempted mass murder. So this is when, a few times, but we're really going to be focusing on when he has the entire army of the missiles and shoots them right back at the ships. And we're going to be going a little bit out of order. I don't really care. So if we're focusing on this first act of terrorism, what could not this it is terrorism, but this is not the terroristic part we're focusing on right now. Is this attempt? So at first they fire on the thing to kill the mutants, pretty much. So the first question, a lot of this is going to boil down to: is he doing it for his own selfish gain or for mutant kind? And if he does it to protect the mutants, then he's a hero. And if he shoots him back, like he shoots him back, we know this. But the other thing is, do the Soviets and Americans shoot it at them at the island because they're mutants or because they're threats? And they could go hand in hand, but in this scenario, it has to be: is it prejudiced or is it something that they do to protect their own countries? In my opinion, I'd say it's not prejudice. They're doing it because they have no clue what's going on. And the reason why I say that is because the prejudice haven't yet formed. We have to look at X Men 97 a bit. It's so good. But in X Men 97, they reference how at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think they mention it in Days of Future Past too, their vendettas and their hatred haven't yet formed. And because it was the first thing mutants have really been exposed to the public. So when you look at something like that, the prejudice against mutants couldn't have formed. You could say, I think it's weird, I don't like it, but your prejudice and hatred is not happening that early on. So I don't think you can really argue that. Does Magneto know that? No. However, I think Magneto does understand that factor. So I think that is a very interesting one to argue. However, you could also argue self defense because if he let those missiles hit, he's dead. So, in my opinion, I think you could say self defense if he just threw the rockets aside. The fact that he throws them back at the people is a show of power and will definitely get him charged with attempted mass murder. And that's a big one, I'll say. The next thing is sabotage. So, this one is a little bit weird. I actually think I messed up in the opening and I said how he went in the minds of the Soviet. No, that wasn't him. So I think I got my peoples mixed up. But for the sabotage, he really does manipulate with the technology to disable the forces. Like that's undeniable. I think he does sabotage both forces. The thing is I'm not really going to talk about this one much because this doesn't really make him a hero or a villain. Because the what this film does so well is the fact that it really sets you in the time period of the 60s. The Soviets and the Americans are a huge part of the plot. However, they're not heroes or you could argue so much here about historical things. In this specific film, they're not protagonistic or antagonistic, they're just against each other. And I'm not saying this in a historical sense, I'm saying this in this film. But now let's look at murder. This is what I really want to talk about because he does commit first degree murder against Sebastian Shaw. So we're going to, once again, I guess we have to discuss what first degree murder is. Like 4 out of these 6 videos, I've had to define it. So first degree murder is when there's a premeditated intent to cause death of another person, which is pretty much when he or she causes the death of a third person, pretty much. I think it's not really a third person. You kind of have to understand the way you describe it. But pretty much it needs to be premeditated. There needs to be some form of premeditation and say, I want to kill this person. So once again, the example we always use is with Green Arrow from the first video. Every time he aims the bow, that's premeditation. He's choosing who he's going to shoot. Even if he doesn't know that person specifically, that's still first degree murder. However, if we look at Superman in the Man of Steel case, that one's not first degree murder because number one, he's not choosing to murder the people. And second, he's not being like, I'm going to hit into that person. If someone dies, then it's manslaughter on his behalf. I'm not going to discuss first or second because that's not this video. But when we talk about murder, this is very much premeditated. He lets that coin go right through his head. Like it takes like a good 30 seconds, I think. It's one of the best scenes in the film. But he very much wants to do it. He goes all around the world to find this guy. Like, this is something very clear in my opinion. So, yes, Shaw, like, this is first degree murder of Shaw, without a doubt. And I think this is the biggest thing that makes Eric a villain. Because going into this point, he was not really doing much bad. Everything he was doing was under the branch of the CIA. At the point that they go into the Cuban Missile Crisis, they are against both America and the Russians. So even though they're technically for the CIA, like technically, they are still they are all pretty much committing treason, except for Eric because we don't know where he really lies. But a lot of them, because they're American citizens and they were appointed by the CIA, that's what's really going to happen. So it's a very murky water for these people. So when we think about what's really going on, it is a terrible act of first degree murder. But why I think this really sets Eric on his path is because this is when he finally gets what he was achieving for years. I don't think we ever get the official ages of when this is, but because we can guesstimate, he's probably about 25, 30 at this point. And he's been manifesting doing this for probably about 30, 25, not 30, like 25-ish years. So when you look at all of that, you kind of have to realize that this was something premeditated for years. And that was his goal. He helped the CIA to kill Shaw pretty much. It was all to kill him. And once he does that, he kind of realizes it goes less about killing Shaw and more about saving Mutantkind. We see him wanting to save Mutantkind a few times here and there. However, it really clicks in his brain once he gets Shaw out of there. Because then he comes outside and he really has that full speech about how the Americans and Soviets want to kill them. And then they shoot the missiles. So we know that Eric has good ideas. We know that he is. And I think something that X-Men 97, which I just have to talk about a bit here, he's really depicted as this massive freedom fighter, which he really is. And it's the same in the X-Men movies as well. He is this freedom fighter. And even though he has these methods of murder and like these terrible acts of violence, he is doing it to help mutant kind. He isn't doing it for his own selfish desires, which I think makes Eric such an interesting villain. Because I think when you look at a villain who kind of just does it for their own selfish needs, it makes them more hateable. But when you look at Magneto, you kind of see why he's doing it. And it adds to that whole other layer of the X-Men. And that's why I think that through Magneto's lens, we see the X-Men universe so well. I think it's him, it's Iceman, a little bit from Wolverine, but really him, Iceman. I just every time I think about it, I'm like, wow, they really took all that they needed to do and put it and really showed it through these two characters. But if we talk about the missile crisis, which is what this video is about, he really does snap. And when that happens, he realizes that his goal is to kind of be this mutant freedom fighter. So once that happens, every one of his actions you could consider heroic because of the way that mutants are treated. However, you also can consider them really terrible because of how many people he murders to get there. And once again, you ask the question, do the ends justify the means? And in my opinion, they don't here. Because, yes, helping the mutant community is good, but if you want to help the community, don't do it by murdering others, because that's not going to show other people. I'm not, like, I think in this scenario, it's a little bit different, and then now we're going to go into a full thing about how to, I'm not going to talk about how to, like, change the way society is, because then we're going to get really political. But the main thing is the fact that he is doing it for the wrong. He's doing it for the right beliefs, but he isn't going about it the right way. So I think that's a big thing. Let's look at the destruction of property. Gonna be honest, don't really care about this one. He destroys a few ships, so what? Things are destroyed in all Marvel movies. The end. Acts of terrorism. This is what I really want to talk about. So the last time we spoke about terrorism was with Malcolm Merlyn, and I think I do have the definition of terrorism on my list. I just have to find it in the doc because I have multiple pages of notes. But pretty much what terrorism is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation against citizens of a country in the pursuit of political aims. So why I say citizens and why my definition, I think from Google says citizens, is because it's not against, like, if there was an act of terrorism committed against like government officials and no citizens knew about it, it wouldn't be real terrorism, because the point of terrorism is to hurt the government by scaring the citizens. In terrorism, you get terror, and I know it sounds like stupid, but terrorism is a really like simple concept when it comes to things like this. We're going to reference now People v. Malcolm Merlyn, which was our second case. And when we discussed that, we said how the undertaking could be this massive spread of second-degree murder or manslaughter. I don't remember what I said there, but a few people were saying maybe terrorism in the comments, and I looked it up. I said, yeah, terrorism very much works. And it's very similar here, because Magneto it's similar, but I'm going to talk about what I actually believe. But is it terrorism to attack soldiers? And why I say that is, if you look at something like World War II and you look at something like Pearl Harbor, that is a terrible attack, but that isn't necessarily terrorism. Terrorism is when you look at something like 9/11. That is terrorism. But because it's not affecting the normal citizen and it really is against these soldiers and generals, number one, could you consider it terrorism? Second, yes, the death of all these people would lead to war against mutants, but it's not leading, it isn't really scaring people. The mutants are what's scaring people. The attacks against the army isn't what is the scary part, which is why it gets so much more challenging to call it terrorism. When you look at Malcolm Merlyn, he was trying to disrupt a specific group of people, but really affected so many more individual citizens, led to a ton of death, led to a ton of terror. That one's obviously terrorism. But when you look at this one, it's so different and it's so much more complex. Because you look at it, and at the end of the day, number one, very few people die by the hands of Magneto. Besides from Shaw, there isn't much death by Magneto because the missiles don't really hit the ships. So it's a huge thing to think about. Because it's attempted terrorism, maybe, but it's not. He never goes through with the terrorism because yes, he is using fear and violence to help, but he isn't real. That isn't the true definition of terrorism. Yes, those are acts of terrorism, but it isn't to the level that it's affecting the normal citizens, which is something I think that is left out of terrorism so often that really defines it as the difference between that and just like an attack or a murder. And that's the, or a massacre, even, like, that's the huge difference. The second thing is terrorism is to spread a message. If those rockets hit, that would have sent a message. But I think the huge thing is the fact that the terrorism doesn't happen. And I don't think you ever really hear attempted terrorism, but that is a lot of what goes on. I think it would be more so attempted murder because attempted terrorism, you don't really know that. Like, I think that's a lot weirder, and I don't fully know all of that. But if you look at attempted murder, that is pretty much attempted first degree manslaughter, I'd say, because it's not. I don't think it's secondary murder, and because secondary murder is with the intent of another person but without premeditation. Actually, yeah, it's attempted second degree murder because I was gonna say manslaughter. Manslaughter is recklessness. I don't believe it's reckless. I'd say this is very much that he wants to kill people, but he doesn't really know who he's killing. Like, I think this is very similar to how I argued Malcolm Merlyn's case. And at the end of the day, I think I said Malcolm Merlyn was a villain still. And we're going to talk about my verdict in just a few minutes. But what I really wanted to talk about here is, do his actions make him seem villainous or heroic? Because if you say he seems villainous, that's fine, but he's doing it to protect his people. While you could say it's heroic, fine, it's heroic, but now he's hurting all these people to get his agenda. And what I think all the X-Men films and comics do so well is the fact that they take these real world events, they take ideas of discrimination and racial things and turn it into the idea of mutations. What if mutation was seen as the same thing as religious discrimination or something? And the difference is mutations you can't get rid of really, except they're now trying ways to get rid of mutations. And then that's when it gets so weird. Is mutations a curse? That's something that we talk about here. And it's a huge thing that I think makes the X-Men comics so different from the other ones because they take on these real world issues. When you look at the Avengers, they don't really take on real world issues the same way that X-Men does. And that's why I love all of the X-Men films, especially X-Men First Class. And when I was rewatching all of these films back in July for my 31 July videos, I really was like, I love the X-Men films because of this reason. And I think that was something I really wanted to pinpoint and talk about more. And I think I'm really discussing it here because what the X-Men films do so well is they make it feels like a period piece, number one. But number two, it really takes these real world issues. And at this point in the video, we're barely talking about Magneto. I think we're still going to, because once we get to the verdict, we're going to talk about murder and stuff. But this video could have been about something entirely different, and a lot of the points would still be the same. So now let's get into my beliefs. So what we're going to be discussing really is, number one, would he be innocent or guilty? And number two, if I think he's a hero or villain. Because most of my videos, we just say innocent or guilty because they're so clear. Here it's not. So this is why I'm going to give my full opinions here. Firstly, in my opinion, he would be found guilty. And the reason why I say that is because first degree there's a lot of attempted things. He attempts a lot of things. Once it becomes first degree murder, that's what pushes the guilty. Because honestly, he could have gotten away with the attempted terrorism, the attempted mass murder, which is a lot. Honestly, those 2 points very much merged. But I think you could argue that he could be innocent. And I think you'd have a very tough time doing so. Because if you look at how Magneto acts, you could argue it until he murders someone for his cause. And at that point, if we look at, we're basing a lot of this on American laws. You can disagree with the government, you can disagree with that stuff, and you can protest. You can't protest through violence, and if you do, you will be in trouble. So that's why I think you will find Magneto guilty, and I think that's a very simple thing. When you look at someone like People v. the Arrow, also I think I've gone to every single court case here, which I am impressed about. But when you look at People v. the Arrow, it's a lot more about morals. Do you believe that even though he commits murder, is it for the greater good because he's saving people? Magneto isn't saving people here. He'd be making a statement. And I think that's what differentiates this so much from Oliver Queen. And even there, I said Oliver Queen is pretty much a villain in season 1 and only becomes a hero once he learns not to kill in season 2. And now from season 3, which I might talk about honestly, it's a whole new lens. And it's such a different thing. But I don't think it's very challenging to argue Magneto will be found guilty because I've already said it all. I'm not going to repeat it again. It's pretty simple. But when we look at, is Magneto a hero or villain? This is when it comes down to morals and ethics. I said this in the first video, I kind of distanced away from it. But really, this is asking, do you personally believe that he could be innocent? Like, is he a hero or villain? And I say this every time. This is all up to you. This is based on your beliefs. I am saying this what I personally believe. I'm not right. I'm not wrong. It's just what I personally believe. So, like all of this, it's just a debate. And in my opinion here, I'd say he is a villain. Because at this point, and the main point I'm going to bring up, is the fact that the prejudices haven't formed. I think that's how you say it, prejudices, I guess. Or the prejudice, I don't know. But I think they haven't formed yet. And a huge part of it is the fact that when you look at it, it's like, oh yeah, he's a freedom fighter. He's fighting for mutants. But that morning, most people didn't know what mutants were. And the people that did knew like very little. So when mutants come out to the world, the prejudices that they're like, oh, we are fighting for mutant kind, those haven't formed yet. The people in like the CIA were making fun of them and stuff. That's not what they're fighting against. They're fighting against like the people who are attacking them. But at the end of the day, they also could have been firing on the island because they didn't know what they were. So I think you could really argue anyway. And Magneto, the reason why you could argue hero is because Magneto says they're gonna hate us, they're gonna fear us, and they do. The issue with that case is the fact that they're not doing it out of hatred at that point. If those rockets hit, the mutants will be the one making the first move, not the Americans. And I think that's yes, they do fire on the island, but you have to think about it more so that even though his actions could be seen as saving mutant kind or helping mutant kind, he's doing so by putting a huge target on mutants' backs. It's making it so mutants are seen as a threat rather than as part of society. And that's the huge part of this like whole part. Because when you even look at what happens in the CIA after, when I think Agent McTaggart's talked to, it's like, oh yeah, I don't remember much. Oh well, whatever. But they really want to know what happened. So it comes down to, it comes down to this huge other point. What is this really about? Because Magneto isn't fighting for mutant kind because mutant kind isn't an enemy yet. They become an enemy after the Missile Crisis, which is this huge point which we'll get once you get into Days of Future Past. It becomes totally different. So I could make another video, part 2 to this, about Days of Future Past, because there's a whole other thing I could discuss there. But I think that's all I'm going to say here because I don't have much else to say. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.